When was the last time your heart trembled for a stranger on a storm-torn night in the Wyoming frontier? A young schoolteacher from Philadelphia, Clara Whitmore, found a man sitting alone in the lamplight trying to mend a torn shirt with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He was a man who'd lost everything. She was a woman trying to start again. If it were you, would you stop and help him or keep walking, pretending you didn't see the loneliness that mirrors your own out there, where the wind cuts like glass and hope feels far away? Two wounded souls found something unexpected, the quiet courage to trust again. But when love begins to bloom, the past comes calling, forcing them to choose between the safety of what's familiar and the terrifying beauty of a second chance. If you've ever lost faith, if you've ever carried a wound too deep for words, this story is for you. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive in a rush of passion. It comes softly. In the moment, you take the needle from someone's shaking hands and realize both of you are learning how to heal. Stay with Frontier Hearts as we tell the story of She Found the Cowboy trying to mend a shirt and took the needle from his shaking hands. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and join us on this journey of love, loss, and healing beneath the wild western sky. The wind came first, a low moan sweeping down from the Wyoming plains, carrying with it the promise of snow. Then came the thunder deep, echoing, rolling over the mountains like drums from another world. Clara Whitmore pulled her coat tighter and pressed herself against the wall of the small station house. The train had left an hour ago, swallowed by darkness and sleet, leaving her stranded in a place whose name she had barely caught, Silver Creek Junction. The night was a living thing, wind howling through the cracks, rain lashing the roof, every sound reminding her how far she was from Philadelphia. 3 weeks of trains, coaches, and weary travelers had brought her here to the edge of the map, where she was supposed to begin again. Inside, a single oil lamp flickered. The dim light revealed wooden benches, a stove gone cold, and the smell of wet wool. 2 passengers had been there earlier, but they'd left when the last coach departed for town before the storm rolled in. Now, only one other soul remained. He sat in the corner by the window, broad-shouldered, hat pulled low, shoulders hunched over something in his lap. His coat was dusted white with snow, and a small pool of melted ice had gathered at his boots. Clara hesitated, curiosity rising through her exhaustion. At first, she thought he might be reading, but then she noticed the glint of a needle catching the lamplight, a long, thin flash of silver trembling between calloused fingers. The man's hands were large, rough from work, and yet they shook as if he were holding something fragile and sacred. He was trying to sew. Clara blinked, certain she was mistaken. Cowboys didn't sew, not in the novels, not in the stories her students used to whisper back east. But there he was, brow furrowed, breath held, trying to push a needle through a torn sleeve. A small streak of red appeared on the fabric blood from his finger. Without thinking, she spoke. "You're making a dreadful mess of that." The man froze. Slowly, he looked up, and the lamplight found his face. He wasn't young, though not old, maybe 33, 34. His eyes were pale blue, the color of winter skies, and there was a gentleness in them that didn't match the rest of him. He gave a half smile. "Ain't much choice, ma'am. It's my only good shirt." Clara hesitated, then stepped closer. Her boots clicked softly against the wooden floor. "May I?" she asked, holding out her hand. For a moment he studied her, perhaps deciding whether she was serious, and then, wordlessly, he placed the needle in her palm. The metal was still warm from his touch. "Much obliged," he murmured. She sat down beside him, careful to leave a polite distance. The tear wasn't bad, a few inches along the sleeve, but the thread was tangled and the stitches uneven. She unwound the thread, rethreaded the needle, and began to work. Her fingers moved easily, remembering the rhythm her mother had taught her long ago in out, pull, tighten. For a while, neither of them spoke, only the rain filled the silence, steady and relentless. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You from the east?" "Yes," she said. "Philadelphia. I came to take the schoolteacher's post in Silver Creek." He nodded slowly. "You've come a long way." She smiled faintly. "That seems to be everyone's first observation." "Can't blame 'em. Not many people trade city gas lights for prairie storms." The warmth of the lamp cast shadows on his face, softening the lines of weariness around his eyes. Clara felt an odd comfort sitting there with him, two strangers sharing the same small pocket of light against the vast, cold dark. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said after a pause. "And you Eli Carver," he replied. "Rancher, a couple miles outside of town." She nodded, her hands still working the needle. "And this ranch of yours, does it treat you kindly?" He let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "Depends on the day. Land can be beautiful here, but it takes its due. Always does." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen both sides of fortune. Clara didn't press further. There was a stillness about him, the kind that comes from surviving things too hard to explain. When she tied off the last stitch, she examined the seam, neat and even, holding firm. "There," she said softly. "Good as new." He leaned forward to look, then gave her a smile that was almost shy. "You do fine work, Miss Whitmore." "It's just sewing," she said. But her chest tightened unexpectedly at his gratitude. Their fingers brushed when she handed him the shirt. And though the contact was brief, something flickered between them, a spark of warmth. Small, but real. "You'd best keep that hand out of the fire," she said. "You're bleeding." He glanced at the spot of red on his finger, then at her. "You fix everything you touch." Clara hesitated, unsure how to answer. "No," she said finally, "but sometimes I try." A gust of wind rattled the door, and the lamp's flame bent sideways before straightening again. Outside, the storm howled louder, as if trying to remind them both that the world beyond those walls was still wild and merciless. Eli glanced toward the window. "You can't make it to town tonight," he said. "The stage road'll be washed out till morning." "I'll stay here," Clara replied. "The station master gave me leave to use the bench." He frowned. "Considering, you'll freeze before dawn." She met his eyes, steady. "I've weathered colder nights." He didn't argue, but his jaw tightened. Then he stood, moving with quiet strength, and crossed to the stove. In moments, sparks leapt inside he'd found wood, coaxed it to flame. The warmth began to creep through the little room. "You didn't have to," she said softly. "Guess I didn't," he said, settling back onto the bench across from her. "But it seemed wrong. Letting the lady who fixed my shirt freeze for her trouble." Clara smiled faintly. The firelight danced on the rough boards, painting them both in the shades of gold and shadow. She watched him for a long moment, the steady movements, the calm patience. There was something fragile beneath that strength, a tremor not in his hands now, but in his voice when he spoke again. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "it helps to have someone steady your hands." She looked down at the needle resting on the table between them. The lamplight caught its edge, gleaming like a promise. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, for the first time in months, Clara felt warm. Morning came pale and cold. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. Every fence post and tree branch glazed in white. Steam rose from the station roof as the first rays of sunlight touched it. Clara opened her eyes slowly, still sitting upright on the bench. The fire in the stove had gone to embers, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and damp wool. Eli was already awake, crouched near the stove, coaxing the coals back to life. He had removed his coat, and the mended shirt she had sewn the night before now hung neatly beside the fire to dry. His movements were quiet, efficient, the kind of calm that comes from years of mornings like this. Clara straightened, brushing the wrinkles from her skirt. Her back ached from the hard bench, but she said nothing. She was aware of how easily this man filled the silence, not with talk, but with presence. He noticed she was awake. "Morning, Miss Whitmore," he said, voice low, roughened by sleep. "Good morning," she replied softly. "The storm's gone, cleared about an hour before dawn. Road'll be muddy, but passable." She glanced toward the small window, where light poured through the frost like diluted gold. "And the stage won't run till afternoon. Maybe longer," he said, "but my wagon's outside. I can take you into town, if you'd like." Clara hesitated. It was improper. She knew a woman traveling alone with a man she'd just met. Yet, as she looked at him, she remembered the steady hands by the fire last night, the quiet respect in his eyes. Her choices were few, and he didn't seem the sort to take advantage of circumstance. "That would be very kind," she said finally. Eli nodded once, as though her answer had been expected. He gathered his things with practiced motions, his coat, the saddlebag, his hat. Before stepping out, he lifted her small travel trunk as though it weighed nothing. Outside, the cold hit her like a wave. The snow had crusted overnight, glittering under the rising sun. His wagon waited near the tracks, the horse stamping impatiently. The harness creaked as Eli climbed aboard, adjusting the reins with care. Clara settled beside him, wrapping her shawl tighter. The air was sharp enough to sting, but the view was breathtaking. Rolling hills stretched endlessly, a world of white broken only by the dark line of pines along the ridge. They rode in silence for a while. The wheels crunched over the frozen mud, and the horse's breath hung like smoke in the air. Clara found herself watching Eli's hands steady now, sure on the reins. The thought came unbidden. Those same hands had trembled last night. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, breaking the silence. He smiled faintly without looking at her. "A bit. I've had worse nights." "You're very calm," she said. "Most men would have been cursing the weather." "Out here," he replied, "you learn not to argue with what you can't change. Wind, rain, loss, they don't listen." The last word lingered between them. She looked at him then, studying the lines around his mouth, the faint scar that ran along his jaw. There was a story there, she thought, but she didn't ask. A mile later, he spoke again. "You really came all the way from Philadelphia to teach in Silver Creek, yes," she said, exhaling a thin cloud of breath. "The town council sent word they needed a schoolteacher. I needed a new start." Eli nodded slowly. "You'll find Silver Creek small, but honest. Folks here notice everything, though you'll be talked about." Clara smiled without humor. "I'm used to that." His eyes flicked toward her, curious but respectful. "City gossip." "Something like that," she said quietly. "I was engaged once. It ended poorly. I decided it was time to go somewhere my name meant nothing." He didn't answer right away. The wagon bumped over a frozen rut, and the motion jostled her closer to him. She steadied herself on the edge of the seat, her gloved hand brushing his sleeve. After a moment, he said, "Starting over takes more courage than folks think." She looked at him. "And what about you, Mr. Carver? What made you come all the way out here?" Eli kept his gaze on the road. "The war," he said simply. "And what came after it? I thought I'd find peace in open land." "Did you?" He gave a small shake of his head. "Sometimes. Some days. I still hear things I'd rather forget." His tone wasn't self-pitying. It was matter-of-fact, quiet as the snow around them. Clara didn't push further. She only said, "I think peace isn't a place. It's something you build, one day at a time." He looked at her then. Really looked. "You sound like someone who's been building a while." Her mouth curved faintly. "I try." For the next hour, they spoke little. The rhythm of hooves and creaking wheels filled the quiet. When they finally reached the ridge overlooking Silver Creek, Clara drew a breath. Below them lay the town, a scatter of wooden buildings hugged close to the frozen river. Smoke rose from chimneys, curling lazily into the pale sky. There was a small church, a general store, a livery, and beyond them, the outline of a schoolhouse, modest, square, with a single stovepipe jutting from the roof. Eli pointed. "That's your post." Clara smiled softly. "It's smaller than I expected. Most things are out here," he said, "but it holds more than it looks." As they descended the hill, townsfolk paused to watch the wagon pass women with baskets, a man stacking crates outside the store, a boy leading a cow down the road. Clara felt the weight of their eyes, the quiet curiosity reserved for newcomers. Eli noticed, too. "They'll come around once they see what you're made of." She turned to him, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "And what exactly am I made of, Mr. Carver?" He gave her a rare, full smile, something steadier than most. The compliment caught her off guard. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Then the wagon stopped in front of a narrow two-story building with a hand-painted sign, Silver Creek Boarding House. Eli jumped down first, landing lightly on the frozen ground. He offered his hand to help her descend. She hesitated, then placed her gloved fingers in his. His grip was firm but gentle, grounding. Inside, the boarding house smelled of bread and pine soap. The landlady, a woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, greeted Clara with polite suspicion. "You're the new teacher." "Yes," Clara said. "Clara Whitmore." The woman nodded briskly. "Your room's upstairs. Supper's at 6. We keep things quiet here." Eli waited until Clara's trunk was set down in the hallway. Then he tipped his hat. "You'll be all right here." She looked at him, reluctant to let the moment end. "Thank you for the ride, and the fire, and the company." He nodded once. "My pleasure, Miss Whitmore." For a second, she thought he might say more, but he only turned to go. The door swung shut behind him, and the sound of his boots faded down the street. Clara stood by the window, watching him climb back onto his wagon. The morning light caught the curve of his shoulders, the steady way he held the reins. He never looked back. when the wagon disappeared beyond the bridge. She exhaled slowly. The silence that filled the room wasn't empty. It felt like the pause between breaths uncertain, waiting for something unnamed. Clara turned away from the window, her heart strangely lighter. Somewhere outside, the river ran beneath a skin of ice, whispering softly through the cold. In that quiet moment, she thought of his words. Sometimes, it helps to have someone steady your hands. She wasn't sure yet what that meant for her, but for the first time in months, the thought didn't scare her. The first week in Silver Creek passed in a blur of names, faces, and the smell of wood smoke. Clara spent her mornings in the little schoolhouse and her evenings grading slates by lamplight, the glow of the fire flickering against the frost on the windows. The building itself was modest one-room, rough timber walls, a potbelly stove that smoked if the wind turned wrong. But it had charm, a kind of determined sturdiness, as if the walls themselves wanted to learn. The children came bundled in coats too big for them, cheeks red from the cold, eyes curious and wary of the woman from the east. She began her first lesson with trembling hands and a steady voice. "Good morning, class. My name is Miss Whitmore." A dozen pairs of eyes stared back, some bright with interest, others restless with mischief. One small boy in the front row whispered something that made his friend snicker. Clara pretended not to notice. She'd taught city children before. She knew the difference between defiance and fear. When the youngest, a girl with tangled blonde hair, raised her hand and asked if Clara's accent was real, laughter rippled through the room. Clara smiled instead of scolding. "It's as real as yours," she said gently. "Now, let's see who knows their letters. By the end of the day." Her throat ached from speaking, her back from bending over the small desks. But as she watched the children run out into the snow, shouting and laughing, something inside her eased. Perhaps she could belong here after all. That evening, Clara walked through town. The main street was little more than a muddy track lined with wooden buildings, a general store, a livery stable, 2 saloons, and a church whose steeple caught the last light of the setting sun. People greeted her politely, some with warmth, others with quiet judgment. At the mercantile, the shopkeeper, Mrs. Palmer, eyed her neatly mended gloves. "You're the new teacher, aren't you?" "My husband's on the town council." "Yes," Clara said. "I just started this week. The children are wild as colts." Mrs. Palmer interrupted with a dry laugh. "You'll have your hands full. Last teacher lasted 2 months before packing her trunk." Clara smiled, refusing to be discouraged. "Then I suppose I'll try for 3. Mrs. Palmer's expression softened, just slightly. "You've got grit. Miss Whitmore, that'll help more than books out here." Later, Clara returned to her small room at the boarding house. She lit her lamp, warmed her hands by the fire, and sat at the window. Outside, the street glowed faintly under a rising moon. She wondered if Eli Carver was somewhere beyond those hills, tending his horses, his hands steady in the lantern light. A knock at her door startled her. When she opened it, she found a small girl standing there, clutching a basket. "Miss Whitmore," the child asked shyly, "Ma says you forgot your parcel at the store." Clara blinked in surprise, taking the small package of sewing thread. "Thank you. Hannah, isn't it?" The girl nodded, eyes wide. "You're nice for a teacher. Ma says you smell like hope." Clara didn't know what to say. She knelt, brushing a curl from Hannah's cheek. That's a lovely thing to say. You tell your mother I said thank you." When the girl had gone, Clara sat at her desk, heart full and aching at once. Hope. The word lingered long after the fire had burned low. 2 days later, Eli appeared at the schoolhouse door. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the hills. The children had already gone home, their laughter fading into the distance. Clara was sweeping the floor when she heard the knock. "Come in," she called, straightening. Eli stepped inside, removing his hat. "Afternoon, Miss Whitmore, Mr. Carver," she said, surprised. "What brings you here?" He held up a small crate. "Firewood. Thought you could use it. Wind's turning colder again." She smiled, leaning the broom against the desk. "You've already done too much for me." "Not hardly," he said. "Town council should have seen to it. I was in town anyway." He set the crate beside the stove, then hesitated, glancing around the small room. "Looks better than I remember. You've made it warmer." Clara's gaze followed his. On the walls, she'd hung drawings the children had made clumsy letters, crooked houses, and stick figures smiling in the sun. "They're learning quickly," she said softly. "And so am I." Eli nodded, a faint smile touching his mouth. "You always this sure about things." She laughed quietly, not even close. For a moment, they stood in companionable silence. The fire crackled, filling the space with a gentle hum. Eli finally cleared his throat. "If you ever need supplies hauled from town, I can spare a wagon now and then. My ranch hands are useless when it comes to errands." "That's kind of you," Clara said. "But I wouldn't want to take you away from your work." He shrugged. "Sometimes it's good to have an excuse to come into town." Their eyes met, then brief, unguarded. Something flickered between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Clara looked away first, pretending to straighten a stack of papers. "The children told me you have the finest horses in Silver Creek." He chuckled. "They exaggerate, but I do all right. I'd love to see them someday," she said without thinking. Eli's brow lifted slightly. "Then you will?" The words were simple, but they lingered long after he left. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the wind. She thought about the way he'd stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, awkward and kind. There was something steady in him that drew her, not romance yet, not even comfort, but recognition. Two people, both carrying invisible weights, learning how to breathe again. The next morning, the wind carried new snow down from the mountains. The town glistened in pale light, quiet and hushed. Clara walked to the schoolhouse early, her boots crunching on the frozen road. As she opened the door, she found a small bundle waiting on the step, a paper-wrapped package tied with twine. Inside was a book, worn but clean. Walden by Henry David Thoreau. On the first page, written in careful script, were 4 words. For when the world feels loud. There was no name, but she didn't need one. Clara traced the handwriting with her finger. Smiling softly, she placed the book on her desk, where the morning light fell across its pages. When the children arrived, she greeted them with a brighter voice, her heart steady in her chest. "Today," she said, "we're going to learn about stories. The ones people tell and the ones we make for ourselves." As the children bent over their slates, she glanced once toward the hills beyond town. Somewhere out there, a man was mending fences, his hands steady in the cold, and though she couldn't see him, she felt the quiet thread that now connected them thin but strong. like a single stitch pulling two torn pieces together. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Clara Whitmore felt she was no longer alone. By late March, the thaw had come to Silver Creek. The snow retreated from the hillsides, revealing patches of dark earth and grass the color of old gold. Streams that had slept beneath ice now ran freely again, carrying the songs of the mountains down into the valley. Clara felt the change in herself as much as in the land. Each morning, as she walked from the boarding house to the school, she could hear birds returning, their notes bright and new. The air smelled of wet soil and pine. The children were restless with the promise of warmer days, their laughter louder, their attention wandering. Yet she didn't mind. Something in their liveliness mirrored her own awakening. On Saturday morning, she was sweeping the classroom when she heard the sound of a wagon outside. She turned and saw Eli stepping down, brushing dust from his coat. His presence filled the doorway as he tipped his hat. "Morning, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Carver," she replied with a smile. "What brings you by today? I came to see if you'd care for a bit of fresh air," he said. "There's a creek a few miles north, good place to walk. Maybe have some lunch." Clara hesitated. It wasn't proper, strictly speaking, but propriety had already loosened its grip on her since arriving in Wyoming. She glanced at his kind eyes, the unspoken respect in his tone, and felt the quiet tug of curiosity. "I'd like that," she said. They rode together in his wagon, the road winding through fields still damp from snowmelt. The land stretched wide under a pale sky, the mountains standing watch in the distance. Clara breathed deeply, the scent of sagebrush sharp and clean. When they reached the creek, Maple Run Creek, he called it, the water sparkled in the light, tumbling over stones and fallen branches. Cottonwoods lined the banks, their buds just beginning to swell. Eli spread a blanket on the grass and unpacked a basket from the wagon bread, cheese, apples, and a small jar of honey. "You're very well prepared for a cowboy," Clara said, amused. He chuckled softly. "Patty packed it. My sister. She said I'd forget food and just bring conversation. Then I owe Miss Carver my thanks," she said, taking a seat. "Though I imagined conversation with you would be sustenance enough." Eli smiled at that, a quiet, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. "I don't talk much," he admitted, "but I listen." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the creek murmuring beside them. The sunlight glimmered on the water, catching motes of dust like tiny stars. Clara dipped a piece of bread in honey. Thoughtful. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "Miss what?" "The life you had before this, before Wyoming." Eli looked toward the horizon, the wind stirring his hair. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "but there's not much left to miss. I came west after the war. Thought I'd find peace out here, away from everything that reminded me of what I'd lost." He paused, the words catching in his throat. Clara didn't rush him. "My wife, Anna, and our little boy died in Kansas," he said quietly. "Fever took them both within a week. I buried them myself. After that, I didn't see much sense in staying." Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to reach for his hand, but didn't. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. "I'm sorry," she said finally. Eli nodded once. "It was a long time ago, but there are days it still feels near." "I understand," she whispered. "Loss doesn't measure itself in years." He looked at her then, eyes soft and searching. "You've lost something too." She hesitated. "Someone," she corrected. "Or maybe just the person I thought he was. Eli said nothing, waiting. I was engaged back east, she said, to a man who admired my independence until it threatened his. I found out he'd been seeing my cousin. They married a month after I left. Eli's brow furrowed, not in judgment, but in empathy. That kind of betrayal leaves a mark. It does, she said quietly, but I decided I wouldn't let it be the end of me. That's why I came here to build something new, even if I had to do it alone. He studied her for a long moment. You're not alone now. The words hung in the air, gentle but certain. Clara's heart gave a small, unexpected flutter. They sat together until the light began to shift. Gold turning to amber. A hawk circled above the hills, its cry echoing faintly across the valley. Eli reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, worn book, the same one she had found wrapped on her schoolhouse steps. You left this behind once, he said softly. Her eyes widened. You? He nodded. Didn't figure I'd sign it. Some gifts are meant to be quiet. Clara turned the book over in her hands, tracing the faded letters on the cover. Why, Thoreau? Eli leaned back, gazing toward the water. Found it in a soldier's pack after a skirmish. Didn't understand half of it back then, but something about his words stayed with me, about finding truth in solitude. Clara smiled faintly. And did you? He looked at her, the corners of his mouth curving. Not until now. The sunlight caught his face just then, and Clara saw what the war and the years had carved into him strength. Yes, but also gentleness, the kind of quiet courage that didn't need to announce itself. A breeze stirred, carrying the scent of thawed earth and distant pine. She felt something shift inside her, not the wild, breathless rush of infatuation, but something steadier, like a door opening where she hadn't realized one existed. Eli, she said softly, you've been very kind to me. He shook his head. It's not kindness, Clara, it's recognition. She tilted her head. Of what? Of someone trying to mend what's been torn. Her eyes stung unexpectedly. She looked down at the creek, blinking hard. You make it sound so simple. It ain't simple, he said, but it's possible. For a long time they listened to the water. Neither spoke again until the sun slipped behind the ridge, painting the world in pale fire. When they finally rose to leave, Clara gathered the blanket while Eli secured the basket. She turned to him, smiling faintly. You were right about this place. It's good for the soul. He gave a quiet laugh. That's why I come here when I forget how to breathe. As he helped her onto the wagon, their hands touched brief, electric. Neither drew back. The road home was bathed in twilight. The mountains glowed purple in the distance. The sky brushed with orange and rose. The only sound was the creak of the wheels and the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves. Clara glanced sideways at Eli, his profile outlined against the fading light. For the first time in a long while, the ache in her chest didn't feel like loss. It felt like the beginning of something tender and alive. She looked back toward the horizon, the town waiting below, and whispered to herself, maybe this is what mending looks like. Eli glanced over, as if he'd heard. What's that? She smiled softly. Nothing, just thinking out loud. He nodded, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. Thinking's good. World needs more of it. When they reached Silver Creek, the first stars had appeared above the rooftops. Eli helped her down, his hand lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Thank you for today, she said. He tipped his hat. Thank you for coming." As Clara watched him drive away, the sound of the wagon fading into the night, she felt a stillness settle over her, not emptiness, but peace, the kind that comes when two lives, bruised and wandering, begin to find their way toward each other. And somewhere in the dark, the creek kept on singing, its voice soft and endless. Winter crept in almost without warning. One morning, Clara awoke to find frost feathering the edges of her window, the glass painted with delicate white ferns. The air was so cold it bit at her breath. Silver Creek lay hushed beneath a pale sky, smoke rising from every chimney. The schoolhouse felt smaller in winter, the walls holding in both warmth and the laughter of children. Clara had grown to know each of them by name and by nature, Thomas and Eli Jr., the mischievous twins, quiet Lila, who read faster than anyone in the class, little Hannah, who still came each morning with her hair in crooked braids and her eyes full of light. By December, the days grew short and the snow came heavier. The sound of the sleigh bells began to echo through town, and lanterns flickered in windows like tiny stars. It was a season meant for comfort. But out here, comfort often depended on how many cords of wood a man could cut before dark. Eli had been visiting town less often since the storms began. His ranch lay 7 miles north, and the trails were treacherous when the snow drifted high. Still, Clara would sometimes catch sight of him on the ridge, a dark figure against the white, riding down with a sack of feed or a bundle of letters for her pupils. When he did appear, the children would whisper and giggle, whispering Miss Whitmore's Cowboy behind their hands. Clara pretended not to hear, though the warmth in her cheeks betrayed her. One Friday afternoon, a blizzard rolled over the hills faster than anyone expected. By the time school let out, the wind was howling and the sky had turned the color of steel. Parents who came for their children struggled through the storm, faces wrapped in scarves, as the last few pupils were bundled onto wagons. Clara realized that 3 children remained: Lila, Thomas, and Hannah. Their families lived miles out, across the frozen flats. The roads were already buried in snow. "We'll have to stay the night here," Clara said firmly. "The storm will pass by morning." She stoked the stove until it glowed red, wrapped the children in blankets, and set about making supper from the meager stores: a tin of beans, some hard biscuits, a few apples. Outside, the wind screamed through the cracks of the window panes. The hours passed slowly. The children eventually drifted to sleep on the benches, their faces soft in the firelight. Clara sat near the stove, reading quietly from the worn book Eli had given her, the words of Thoreau. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation felt strangely fitting. It was near midnight when she first smelled smoke. For a moment she thought it came from the stove, but then she saw the faint orange flicker through the frosted glass. She rose quickly, heart hammering, and ran to the door. Outside, the barn across the yard was ablaze. The storm had torn loose a lantern, and now flames devoured the dry timber, snapping and roaring against the wind. "Dear God," she whispered. The barn stood only a few yards from the schoolhouse. Sparks leapt through the night like fireflies, carried by the wind toward the wooden roof above her head. She turned back to the sleeping children. There was no time to think. "Wake up," she cried, shaking them gently but urgently. "Get your coats. Quickly now." The oldest boy, Thomas, rubbed his eyes. "Miss Whitmore." "What fire?" she said. "We have to go, right now." The wind fought her at every step as she ushered them outside. clutching their small hands. Snow blinded her, stung her face, filled her mouth when she tried to shout. The world was a blur of white and orange, fire and ice. She pushed the children toward the small rise beyond the yard, the only place clear of drifting snow. "Stay there," she ordered. "Don't move until I come for you." But then she saw at the corner of the roof, catching, a small tongue of flame licking along the shingles. Inside the schoolhouse were the papers, the ledgers, the books she'd begged from the council and townsfolk, everything she had built since coming here. Everything the children needed would vanish in minutes. Without thinking, Clara ran back inside. The heat hit her like a wall. Smoke curled along the ceiling, thick and choking. She coughed, pulling her scarf over her mouth, eyes stinging. She grabbed the ledger from her desk, then the box of readers and the few precious maps pinned to the wall. Flames crackled above her, and she heard a sharp crack as part of the roof beam gave way. She stumbled toward the door, but the smoke had grown too heavy, the light too dim. Panic surged, raw and hot. She couldn't find her way. Then a voice cut through the roar of the fire. Clara Eli burst through the doorway, snow and smoke swirling around him. His coat was half open, his hair dusted white with frost. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close, dragging her toward the cold air beyond the threshold. She gasped as they fell into the snow together, coughing violently. He shielded her with his body as a piece of burning timber crashed behind them. "What in God's name were you thinking?" he shouted over the wind. "The books," she rasped, still clutching the box in her arms, "the children's books." He stared at her, breath steaming in the freezing air. Then let out a disbelieving laugh, half anger, half admiration. "You're out of your mind." "Clara Whitmore." "Perhaps," she said faintly. He looked at her a long moment, then pressed his gloved hand against her cheek. "But you're brave." Behind them, the barn burned itself to ash. The fire had spared the schoolhouse for now, thanks to the snow that smothered its roof. But Clara was trembling violently, her dress soaked, her skin pale beneath the soot. Eli gathered her into his arms. "You can't stay out here. You'll freeze." The children were waiting on the hill, wide-eyed and shivering. He called to them through the storm. "Come on, little ones. We're heading for the ranch." They made their way through the snow, Eli carrying Clara half the distance when her legs gave out. The wind howled around them, fierce and merciless, but he kept going. His breath came in ragged bursts, the muscles in his jaw tight with determination. By the time they reached the ranch, dawn had begun to break a weak, gray light over the mountains. Eli's foreman rushed to help the children inside, while Eli carried Clara straight to the hearth. He knelt there, setting her down gently near the flames. Her teeth chattered so hard she couldn't speak. Eli stripped off his coat, wrapped it around her shoulders, then held her hands between his to warm them. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe." She tried to smile, her voice barely a whisper. "You came." "I was already halfway here," he said, saw the glow from the ridge. The firelight flickered across their faces, painting them in gold and shadow. He brushed a lock of damp hair from her forehead, his touch trembling just slightly. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice breaking. Her eyes lifted to his, soft and shining. "You found me instead." Neither spoke after that. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the slow, steady rhythm of their breathing. Outside, the storm began to ease. The wind softened, and the first rays of sun slipped through the clouds, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. Eli leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "You fixed my shirt once," he whispered. "Guess it's my turn to fix what's torn." Clara closed her eyes, her lips trembling into a smile. Then, "Don't let go." Eli Carver. He didn't, and for the first time since the night they met, his hands did not shake. When Clara woke, the world was quiet. For a long moment she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was made of dark, hand-hewn beams. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee. Then memory returned the storm, the fire, Eli's voice calling her name through the smoke. She tried to sit up, but her body protested. Her head ached, her throat raw from the smoke she'd breathed in. A heavy quilt covered her, soft and warm. When she turned her head, she saw Eli sitting by the hearth, his elbows resting on his knees, a mug cradled between his hands. He looked up the instant she stirred. Relief washed over his face so clear it made her chest ache. "Easy now," he said quietly, setting the cup aside. "You've had a rough night." Clara managed a faint smile. "How long have I been asleep since before dawn? It's near noon now." She blinked at the light spilling through the window. Outside, the snow glittered under a clear blue sky, so bright it almost hurt to look at. "The children, are they safe?" Eli nodded. "All safe. My foreman took them home once the wind let up. They'll be talking about last night till spring." Relief loosened something inside her, and she sank back against the pillow. Thank heaven. He poured her a cup of water and brought it to her, steadying her hand as she drank. His touch was careful, almost reverent, as though afraid she might vanish if he wasn't gentle enough. "You shouldn't have gone back in there," he said after a moment. "You could have." He broke off, unable to finish. Clara looked at him over the rim of the cup. "Lost everything I've worked for. I couldn't just stand there." He gave a quiet, rueful laugh. "You're the only person I know who'd run into a burning building for a box of books." "They weren't just books," she said softly. "They were promises. To the children, to this town, to myself." Eli's expression softened. He sat back, watching her for a long time. "You remind me of the land out here," he said finally. "Soft when it wants to be, but tougher than people think." The words sank deep, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Instead, she studied him, the lines of his face, the faint scar near his temple, the quiet strength in his hands. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come," she said. He shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not," she said. "But gratitude isn't about owing. It's about recognizing what matters." Their eyes met, and for the first time, neither looked away. There was something in that silence, something that felt fragile and infinite all at once. Eli cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "You should eat. You'll feel steadier." He brought her a tray with toast and honey, the same jar they'd shared by the creek months before. She smiled at the memory. "You still have this?" she asked. "Couldn't bring myself to finish it," he said. "Guess I was waiting for a reason." After she'd eaten, he insisted she rest again, though she protested. The truth was, she didn't want to leave the warmth of his cabin. The walls were lined with books and photographs, one of a young woman holding a baby, faded with time. Clara's gaze lingered on it. "Your wife?" she asked softly. He nodded, his voice low. "Anna, and our boy, Michael." Clara's heart clenched. "You must miss them terribly." He looked into the fire for a long moment before answering. Every day, but last night, when I saw the flames, it was the first time in years I was scared of losing someone again. That's how I knew what he met her eyes, that I'd already lost enough in this life, and that I couldn't stand to lose you too. The room went still. Clara felt her pulse quicken, the world narrowing to the space between them. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Eli stood, restless, crossing to the window. "I know it's too soon," he said, his voice rough, "and I know you've got your own ghosts. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I just needed you to know." Clara rose slowly, the quilt still wrapped around her shoulders. "You have a way of saying the hardest things like they're simple truths." "They are simple," he said quietly. "It's living with them that's hard." She stepped closer until they stood a breath apart. The sunlight caught the dust motes between them, turning the air to gold. "Eli," she said softly, "you've shown me more kindness than I deserve, more patience than I knew a man could have, but I don't want you to carry my heart out of pity, or because the past still aches." He looked down at her, his voice steady. "I'd never mistake you for someone I could pity." Her hand lifted of its own accord, brushing against his jaw. The roughness of his stubble, the warmth beneath it, grounded her. "You're a good man," she whispered. He gave a small, uneven smile. "Don't go telling folks that. They'll expect too much of me." She laughed softly, and for a moment, the heaviness between them broke. But beneath it lingered something deeper, a recognition that both of them were standing at the edge of something new, something fragile that neither wanted to frighten away by naming. By afternoon, Clara was strong enough to stand. Eli saddled his horse and offered to ride her back into town. The air was crisp and still, the snow glinting like crushed glass under the sun. As they rode side by side, the world seemed reborn clean, bright, full of breath again. The smoke-blackened frame of the old barn was the only reminder of the night before. When they reached Silver Creek, townsfolk emerged from their homes to greet them. The story of the fire had already spread, carried on the storm winds. Mrs. Palmer from the mercantile hurried forward, pressing Clara's hands. "You saved those children, dear. You're the bravest woman I know." Clara flushed. "I only did what anyone would have. Not everyone would have done it." "Mrs.," Palmer said firmly, "you've earned this town's respect. Miss Whitmore." Eli stood back, watching the exchange. There was pride in his eyes, but something else too, protectiveness, perhaps, or quiet awe. When the crowd dispersed, he stepped closer. "You see," he said softly, "this place was waiting for you all along." Clara looked around at the familiar faces, the small schoolhouse still standing proud despite the smoke stains. For the first time, she believed him. "Maybe it was," she said. They stood together for a while, the winter sun slanting low over the rooftops. The moment was peaceful, but beneath it ran a current of something neither could quite name. Before he left, Eli reached into his coat and handed her a small object wrapped in cloth. "What's this?" she asked. "Something that belonged to my boy," he said quietly. "A horseshoe charm. He kept it with him every time I went to town." Clara unfolded the cloth. The tiny brass horseshoe glinted in her palm, worn smooth by years of touch. "Eli, I can't take this." "You're not taking it," he said. "You're keeping it safe, like you did those books." Her throat tightened. She closed her fingers around the charm, holding it close. "Then I'll keep it safe. I promise." He nodded once, the smallest smile ghosting his lips. That's all I needed to hear. As he rode away, the wind carried his silhouette up the ridge until he was only a dark figure against the pale horizon. Clara stood there until he was gone, the horseshoe warm in her hand. Her heart caught between gratitude and longing, and though she didn't know what the coming months would bring, she knew this: the man who had once shaken trying to mend a shirt now held her world steady, one heartbeat at a time. By March, the snow along the ridge had melted into rivulets that shimmered like glass under the morning sun. The valley was waking, green returning to the land as though painted there by invisible hands. Birds had come back to the cottonwoods, and the creek ran high, swollen with meltwater and the songs of spring. For Clara Whitmore, each new dawn brought a deeper peace. Her schoolhouse had been repaired, its charred beams replaced with fresh-cut timber. The smell of sawdust and chalk lingered in the air, a comforting scent that mingled with the laughter of children. She often thought of that night, the fire, the fear, and Eli's voice breaking through the smoke. But now, those memories felt less like terror and more like a promise kept. He came to town often, sometimes with a wagon of supplies for the school, sometimes just to bring her small things: a jar of wild honey, a book he'd found in Cheyenne, a simple hand-carved quill holder. Each gift said what words could not, and yet, though their bond deepened, neither had spoken of the future. It hung between them like a note half played, suspended in quiet hope. One crisp morning, as Clara dismissed her pupils, the postmaster arrived carrying a small bundle of letters. "Got one for you, Miss Whitmore," he said, tipping his hat, Philadelphia postmark. Clara's heart gave a small, uncertain lurch. She hadn't received a letter from home in nearly a year. She thanked him and carried the envelope inside, her fingers trembling slightly as she broke the seal. The handwriting was familiar, neat, elegant, unmistakable. Her father's: "My dearest Clara, we've heard news of your remarkable bravery during the fire. The paper here even mentioned a schoolmistress in Wyoming who saved her pupils from harm. Your mother was near tears when she read it. I know things between us were strained when you left, and for that I bear much of the blame. I should have supported your decision to teach instead of pushing you toward the life we expected. Philadelphia misses you, my dear. And there's something else you must know, Thomas Everett. Yes, that Thomas has returned from Europe, quite changed, or so your aunt says. He asked after you. We would love to see you home again, even if only for a visit. You have done more than enough to prove your strength and independence. Perhaps it is time to come back and let life be easier. With love." Father Clara read the letter twice, her pulse unsteady. The words should have comforted her, but instead they stirred something she couldn't name, a quiet confusion that unsettled the peace she'd built. That night, she sat at her desk long after the lamps were lit, the letter spread before her like a mirror of her old life. When a knock came at the door, she started. Eli stood outside, hat in hand, his expression warm. "Evening, Miss Whitmore. I was in town and thought I'd check in, make sure you've enough firewood." She smiled faintly. "I always seem to have enough when you're near." He chuckled softly, then noticed the papers on her desk. News from home. She hesitated, then nodded. "A letter from my father. He wants me to visit Philadelphia." Eli's face remained calm, but his eyes betrayed something a flicker of worry quickly masked. "That's good, isn't it? You must miss your folks." "I do," she said quietly, "but it feels like a lifetime ago. I don't know if I'd still fit there." He nodded, gaze fixed on the fire. "World's got a way of making us outgrow the places we came from." Silence stretched between them. Clara wanted to tell him how she felt that Philadelphia no longer felt like home, that it was here, in this wild, open country, that she'd begun to breathe again. But the words tangled in her throat. Eli cleared his throat. "I brought something." He reached into his coat and handed her a small parcel wrapped in burlap. Inside was a silver locket, its surface etched with delicate vines. When she opened it, she found two tiny sketches, one of a horse grazing under a cottonwood, the other of an open book resting on a desk. Clara's breath caught. "You drew these?" He looked down, sheepish. "When the days get too quiet, I like to keep my hands busy. Figured you might want to keep a bit of Silver Creek close if you do decide to go." Her heart clenched at the gentle ache in his words. "Eli." He shook his head, a small, rueful smile playing on his lips. "No need. I just wanted you to have something to remind you that this place, these people, will be waiting if you come back." She touched the locket, feeling its weight in her palm. "You talk as if I've already decided to leave." He met her eyes, steady but guarded. "You don't have to say it. I can see the thoughts already weighing on you." Clara turned toward the window. Outside, twilight had softened the world to shades of blue and silver. "When I left Philadelphia, I thought I was running from heartbreak, but now I think I was running toward something, toward you." Eli's breath hitched, though he said nothing. "But the letter," she continued, voice trembling slightly. "It reminded me how easy it is to lose what we've found, how fragile peace can be." Eli took a step closer, his voice low. "Peace isn't something you find, Clara. It's something you fight to keep." She turned to him then, tears shining in her eyes. "And what if I can't stay? What if I have to go back?" He hesitated, then said simply, "Then I'll wait. For as long as it takes." It was such a simple promise, spoken without ceremony, that she could barely breathe for the weight of it. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Eli tipped his hat, murmured good night, and left her standing in the quiet glow of lamplight, the locket cool against her palm. That night, Clara dreamed of two worlds, the narrow streets of Philadelphia and the open plains of Wyoming, and woke before dawn, caught between them. The following week passed in a blur of school lessons and quiet reflection. She wrote letters she never sent, began packing, then unpacked again. Each day she found herself walking the ridge outside town, where she could see Eli's ranch far in the distance. Then, one afternoon, a familiar figure appeared at the schoolhouse door, Patty Carver. "Eli's sister. Miss Whitmore," she said, cheeks flushed from the ride. "Eli's been thrown from his horse." Clara froze. He's alive," Patty said quickly, "but hurt bad. The doctor's there now." Clara didn't think. She grabbed her shawl and ran. The trail to the Carver ranch was still slick with spring mud, but she barely noticed. Her skirts were streaked with earth by the time she reached the barn. Inside, Eli lay on a cot, his face pale, his arm bound in a sling. He looked up as she entered, managing a faint smile. "Guess I'm not as young as I used to be." She went to him, tears rising unbidden. "You scared me half to death." "I didn't mean to." he murmured, was trying to break a young colt. The colt won. Clara knelt beside him, taking his hand in both of hers. You shouldn't be moving about. You need rest. He looked at her with that quiet steadiness she had come to know so well. You came fast. I couldn't stay away. The words slipped out before she could stop them. For a moment, they just stared at each other, two souls who had spent so long surviving that love had crept in unnoticed. Quiet as dawn. Eli's voice broke the silence. Then, maybe that's your answer. She frowned slightly. My answer to what? To where you belong? Her grip on his hand tightened. I already know. The fire crackled beside them. Outside, the wind carried the scent of thawing earth and the promise of rain. And in that fragile stillness, Clara felt the truth settle in her chest like a heartbeat steady, certain, and alive. The scent of lilacs drifted through the open window. Morning light poured into the small cabin at the Carver ranch, painting everything in soft gold. Eli sat by the window, his arm still bound, watching the breeze move through the tall grass outside. Each movement of the wind felt like a reminder of how alive the world could be, even after pain. Behind him, Clara's voice was a quiet hum as she folded fresh linens. The doctor said your shoulder's healing faster than he expected, she said, setting the stack on the table. Guess I've got a good nurse, he replied. She turned, smiling faintly. You've got a stubborn patient's luck. He chuckled, then winced as pain flickered across his face. Clara was beside him in an instant, steadying his sling. Their hands brushed, and the air between them shifted charged, tender, familiar. You should still rest, she said softly. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Hard to rest when there's too much to think on. Clara hesitated. The letter. He nodded. You'll have to answer it eventually. Her gaze dropped. The envelope still sat on the mantel, her father's tidy handwriting like a ghost from another life. I keep trying, she admitted, but every time I start, I can't find the words. Eli turned his eyes back to the fields outside. Maybe that's your answer. Clara, if you had to go, you'd have gone already. She sat beside him, the quiet stretching between them. It isn't that simple, she said at last. There are people who love me back east. My parents, my friends, they still see me as the woman who left. But I'm not her anymore. Eli's lips curved slightly. No, you're not. You've grown stronger than you realize. She smiled, but there was a sadness in it. You make it sound like strength is always a good thing. He studied her face. Out here, it's the only way to survive. Silence again, but this time it was a comfortable one. The sound of the wind through the cottonwoods filled the room. Clara reached for the kettle, poured him a cup of coffee, and then one for herself. They sat together like that, side by side, the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. Later that afternoon, Patty came by with her usual whirlwind of chatter. You two look cozy, she teased, setting down a basket of biscuits. If I didn't know better, I'd say the schoolmistress has taken up residence here. Clara blushed, just until Eli's stronger. Patty grinned. That's what you said last week. She turned to her brother. You'd best heal quick. Eli Carver, or the whole town will start planning a wedding without you. Eli shot her a look that made her laugh all the way out the door. Clara shook her head, flustered but smiling. She has no filter. No, Eli said, eyes warm, but she's rarely wrong. Clara opened her mouth to reply but stopped when she saw his expression open. honest, unguarded. Her pulse quickened. Eli. He reached for her hand. "Don't say anything you're not sure of," he said softly. "I meant what I told you. You've got to choose for yourself. I'll never hold you back from whatever life calls you." She looked down at their joined hands, his rough from years of work, hers pale and delicate against his. "And if life calls me here," she whispered. His thumb brushed her wrist, slow and reverent. "Then I'll spend the rest of my days thanking the good Lord for it." The next morning, Clara rode into town early. The hills were alive with wildflowers, blue lupine, and Indian paintbrush, stretching for miles. Each step of her mare's hooves stirred up the scent of earth and dew. At the post office, she handed a sealed envelope to Mr. Lyle, the postmaster. He glanced at the address, Philadelphia. She nodded. "Yes, but it's not a letter of return, just a goodbye." He gave her a kind smile. "Reckon that's harder to write than the other kind." "Harder," she said, "but truer." She left before he could ask more. Outside, the air was bright with sunlight, and for the first time since the letter had arrived, she felt light, free. When she returned to the schoolhouse, the children were already there, chasing one another through the grass. The building stood proud, its whitewashed boards gleaming in the morning light. The sign above the door, Silver Creek School, had been freshly painted by Eli himself. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," the children chorused. She smiled, her heart swelling. "Good morning, my scholars. Let's begin, shall we?" The day passed quickly, laughter filling every corner. By the time she dismissed the last pupil, the sun had dipped low, turning the world to amber. As she closed her books, a familiar shadow appeared at the door. Eli leaned against the frame, hat in hand, looking every bit the image of a man healed in more ways than one. "You walked here?" she asked. "Doctor said it's good to move the arm." He said with a grin, "I thought I'd take him at his word." She laughed softly. "And what brings you to my classroom, Mr. Carver?" He held out a small bundle wrapped in linen. "Brought you something." Inside was a polished wooden box, carved with the same pattern of vines as the locket he'd given her weeks before. She opened it carefully and gasped. Inside lay a folded sheet of parchment, a small golden key, and a deed marked with her name. She looked up, stunned. "Eli, what is this?" He shifted, suddenly self-conscious. "It's the deed to a piece of land next to my ranch. Small place, but good soil. Thought maybe the town could use another schoolhouse, or maybe just a home for the teacher." Her throat tightened. "You can't just give me land." He smiled faintly. "I'm not giving it to you. I'm asking you to build something with me, whatever you want it to be." The room swam in her vision, the edges blurring with unshed tears. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Are you asking me what I think you are?" Eli took a breath. "I'm not much for fancy speeches, but, Clara Whitmore, you've been the light in every dark place I've ever known. If you'll have me, if you'll stay, I'd be proud to call you my wife." The quiet that followed was absolute. Outside, a breeze stirred the curtain, carrying the scent of spring through the open window. Clara reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "You once told me peace is something you fight to keep. I think I've finally found mine." And then, without hesitation, she kissed him. It was a slow, steady kiss, nothing hurried, nothing uncertain. Just the meeting of two people who had finally come home to themselves. When they parted, Eli's eyes were bright, his hand still wrapped around hers. "So, that's a yes." She laughed through tears. It's the only yes that's ever mattered. Weeks later, the whole town gathered for the wedding. It was simple, held under the cottonwoods by Maple Run Creek, where they'd first shared a meal and their stories. The sky was vast and blue, the water running clear beside them. Patty wept openly, while the children scattered wildflowers at Clara's feet. Eli wore a suit borrowed from the preacher, and Clara a dress sewn by the town seamstress, its hem trimmed with lace from her mother's old shawl. When the minister asked if they would love, honor, and build together all their days, both answered without hesitation. And when Eli kissed her beneath the open sky, the valley itself seemed to hold its breath, then exhale in birdsong and laughter. As the evening light turned gold, Clara stood beside her husband, watching the children dance barefoot in the grass. Eli slipped his hand into hers. "So," he said, smiling, "any regrets about not going back east?" She shook her head. "I did go home. Eli." He looked at her, puzzled. She turned toward the horizon, where the land stretched out wide and free. "I just didn't realize until now that home was here, with you." And as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Silver Creek glowed like something holy, a place where two hearts, once broken, had finally found their way back to life. The story of Clara Whitmore and Eli Carver reminds us that love is not about finding someone flawless. It's about finding someone willing to sit beside us and help mend what life has torn apart. In a harsh land where people learn to survive more than to feel. They chose something rare. They chose to believe again, to open their hearts even when it hurt, to stay even when leaving would have been easier. Each of us, in our own way, carries a torn shirt, a piece of our past, a loss, a hope that faded too soon. But like Clara and Eli, we can pick up the needle, take a breath, and begin to stitch ourselves whole again. Their story isn't about grand gestures, it's about quiet courage, about how kindness, patience, and faith in one another can turn even the loneliest frontier into a home. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone you once loved, or the strength you didn't know you still had, thank you for being here. Your time means more than words can say. Please like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts, where we tell stories of love that endure beyond distance, doubt, and time itself. Because somewhere out there, beneath the same wide sky, another heart might need to hear this one too.